All right, welcome back. Hello again. It's Dr. Vulich here with your most recent lecture on ethics for our semester. So, um, today we're continuing our current course unit as we explore the ethics of animals and the environment, and with particular attention to the question of whether animals have moral rights. Should their pain and pleasure be considered equal to human pain and pleasure? Do they have interests that compare with any of ours? Is the status quo involving the use of animals for food, clothing, or medical or other scientific experiments? Is there any reason that those things are wrong, or is the moral status quo justified? What's the status of animals, morally speaking? So we've already learned about one author's view on this question. That's Peter Singer. Um, Peter Singer's utilitarian in his overall moral philosophy, so he thinks that it's our moral obligation to take the action that creates the most overall pleasure for the greatest number of people. And he thinks that animals, with the capacity that they have for pain and pleasure, should be included in utilitarian judgments about what to do. And in particular, he highlights the what he calls equal consideration of interest principle. So what that principle says is that when interests are alike, they should be given equal consideration. So whether it's a man or a woman, for example, we shouldn't weigh one of their interests in being able to vote more than the other because they're exactly alike in the sense of having the same interest there. So same interest, same regard, same consideration or weight. He thinks that this equal consideration principle should apply to at least the interest that we share in common with the animals, and the relevant interest that we share in common with them, as he argues, is the capacity to, well, anyway, I'll put it this way, the interest in avoiding pain. So since we have an interest in avoiding pain, so animals, he thinks that we should give the same level of consideration and respect to the human interest as we do to the animal interest in the same. That doesn't establish exactly equal treatment of animals, because, for example, they can't have equal rights if there's no interests that could be comparable to our own. So, like, we can't say animals have an interest in voting or practicing a given religion or freedom of speech. But where there's an interest that they have in common with us, he thinks we should regard it with the same level of significance and weight. And the one interest that he thinks is fair to say that we have in common with non-human animals is that capacity for pain, and therefore the interest in avoiding pain and suffering. But if we, live by that, and we weighed their pain and suffering as equal to our own, and we weighed it in utilitarian decision making, then he does not think that we could morally justify such practices as using factory farmed meat that's produced through animal agriculture processes that really expose them to tons of pain and suffering for the sake of non-essential pleasures. He says that the benefit derived from using the animals cannot be argued as like some essential aspect of survival or health, because it's been shown, I guess, that consumption of meat is not necessary for health or longevity. So it's really more about the pleasures of the taste, the pleasures of the quality of meat as a palate preference. And in his view, you can't sacrifice major to minor interests if you are going to be consistent as a utilitarian. And if you weigh the interests equally to ours anyway, then you wouldn't be able to justify such pain and suffering unless there was some kind of really extreme and necessary benefits that could be derived from it. Now, he considered a range of objections to his view, like, for example, the Ben Franklin objection that, they eat each other, so why shouldn't we be eating them? Or at least why shouldn't it be the same moral status as they eating each other, which nobody thinks is wrong. The whole argument that they eat each other, so what's wrong with us eating them? He finds a few flaws. He said they can't make moral choices like we can, and in many of their cases, they eat out of necessity because it's needed for their survival. Whereas for humans, we're obligate carnivores in the sense that we don't have to eat that if we don't want to, and there's many vegetarians that don't. Yeah, and he also considers another objection, something along the lines of partiality and favoritism for our own kind is necessary for our treatment of each other to be appropriate. But he doesn't think that that's a good principle to live by. It's not good to uh, let's say, let our feelings determine how the moral status of something. And if you're saying that it would be based on feelings of favoritism and partiality that could bond us together, that would seem to give credence to the principle that those feelings have moral significance. But he thinks that that's an inconsistent guide to what's right, since some people have tighter bonds with inanimate objects or with pets than other humans, and we don't want their moral status to depend on those subjective aspects of how much one values them. Furthermore, some people will try to say that there's major differences between humans and animals, and that might be one thing to defend the status quo. From Peter Singer's view, even if we could point out such differences like tool use, language, self-conscious planning for the long term, uh, if they either don't have those things, which he's also questioning to some extent, they may have a version of some of those things, even if it's on a slightly lower level, perhaps. But even if they did not have those things, he doesn't see why that should be relevant to the major question of whether they can suffer or not, which is the relevant shared interest that his equal consideration principle would apply to. So in the end, he knows that some people might not like the case that he makes sometimes that says we're relevantly similar to the animals in the sense that we can suffer pain and pleasure, even if we may have higher intellectual abilities. That's not the factor that gives them moral status or standing. That kind of argument often mentions some parallels between, let's talk about mentally disabled human beings or infants, and then non-human animals, which are at similar levels of cognitive sophistication. And it's often argued that if you're going to try to make some cognitive criteria for membership in the moral community, then you would have to exclude humans with these mental disabilities. And he thinks that's one other reason that that's a wrong criteria. It should only be based on capacity for pain and suffering, which would include them both, and not exclude either one. But some people don't like the implied assertion there that there's some kind of parallel that can be drawn between the mentally disabled human specimen and then the animal that they're being compared with. Because people want to say that they have a moral status that is higher than that of the animal, because animals, again, can be used for food, clothing, and experiments. But of course, no one would want to do the same thing to a human, even if they had a mental disability, of course. So what can be said about that to distinguish the two cases of the mentally disabled, let's say, or the infant human, and then the non-human animal that has a similar level of cognition or cognitive function? One way of trying to distinguish between the two would be to say that the human beings are at least a member of a rational species, even if they are themselves not fully capable or cognitively high functioning. And the animal, on the other hand, can't be made to say the same thing. You can't say that the animal is a member of a species that's normally rational, because it's just normal to lack language and abstract thought and so forth for their form of life. So maybe that makes a distinction. But he doesn't like that because he says it's like judging an individual based on a group from which there are one member. And normally, morally speaking, you would think that we should judge people based on their individual merit, not based on their identity as a member of a group. Finally, he knows that some people don't like the equivalence drawn between the moral standing of non-human animals and humans with similar levels of cognitive function. Some people might think that that will lead to a slippery slope where we start to abuse and mistreat the mentally disabled humans or the low cognitively functioning humans, because we see them in terms similar to animals who we already generally mistreat in a lot of ways at scale. And he thinks that's getting his argument exactly backwards, because even if he makes the point that there are similarities between animals and humans, especially those, let's say, that are maybe mentally disabled and have a similar kind of intellectual capacity as an animal would have, his reasoning behind trying to identify the cases is not to say that that means we should downgrade the treatment of such human beings to the current levels of treatment of animals, but for the opposite reason, to try and make this argument about their similarities so that we will be more willing to regard those animals in moral terms that are somewhere parallel to the way we already think about our mentally disabled human friends and so forth. So that was Peter Singer. Now I want to make one mention of something. I've distributed the essay prompts the essay prompt for the second essay that's due in about 2 weeks. It's just on this topic of animals, so all these lectures on the topic are, of course, important and good. There's a few elements to the paper. First of all, for formatting, it's just like paper one. It's going to be 12-point font, double spaced. Include just some basic info like your name, the name of the essay, and then you can just get right to it. I don't want you to have too many items in the header so that it takes up a lot of the space for the writing. But if you'd like to have all that extra stuff, you could create a separate cover page. It's good to include quotes from our textbook. Any information and facts that are coming out of these lectures or the textbook, it's good to make mention of them. If you have quotes or close paraphrases from this book, I will encourage you to put in some quotes. It always makes an essay more academic, scholarly, and strong. So if you're going to put in anything, whether it's be quotes or close paraphrases, for quotations, just place whatever quotation and cite quote marks, and then at the end of the sentence, whatever, or passage, just put the page number in parentheses that you found it in from the book. If you have a close paraphrase where you're not using the actual language of the book, but it's something that you think is creditable to the section you were reading or whatever, you can also just put a parenthetical citation of the page number there too. There's no need for a separate works cited or bibliography because all I'm asking for you to do is to refer to the one textbook. Now, you're also not allowed to use anything else, though, besides this textbook, your course notes, these lectures, and your common sense. So I don't want you, trying to go on the internet and find whatever a million different people have said about these authors and their writings, because I want you to kind of rely on the content that you're getting out of this class. So, okay, anyway, that's about some of the format. No need for extra spacing between paragraphs, just a normal double spacing all the way through. So we said 12-point font, normal spacing, normal margins. Don't expand or minimize the margins in any way. Let those stand as the defaults. The intro and the conclusion of the philosophy essay can be kind of minimalist. You can just kind of get right to the point. You don't even really need an intro and a conclusion. If you don't want one, you could just start addressing the prompt and its questions from the first line. So the paper is about animals, and I believe, I'm not looking at the text right now, but the first part says, explain the moral theories of Kantianism and utilitarianism. So for that first part of the essay, you'll have to just kind of go back through some of our early notes in the class and report on your ability to comprehend and just in a detailed, accurate way the two big moral theories that we studied. So you'll talk about utilitarianism, which says that, well, first off, it's consequentialist. It says the consequences of the action determine the morality, and the specific kind of consequences that matter most are those that bear on total human happiness, because happiness is the only thing that we pursue as an end and not as a means. This was given to us by John Stuart Mill, among other people. And then you talk about Kantian ethics, which is duty-based. It says to act from a sense of duty to uphold the moral law. The moral law, Kant believes, is expressed in two versions of the categorical imperative, which is a principle that reason can reflect on, which will reveal what the right and wrong actions are and what the moral law commands and what it forbids. So one version of the categorical imperative says only act on maxims that could be universal laws, so only do actions that could be universalized without any contradiction. And then the other version says to never treat a person as a means. His own writing it says that never treat a human being as a means to an end, but always as an end in itself. Now, I would say that second version of the categorical imperative will be especially important for you to mention and explain in the early going section of your paper where you're reporting on the two moral theories, because that version of the categorical imperative will come in handy later as you're reporting on the different authors' views about animals. So the rest of it says, so using the authors that we have read about animals, and those are going to be Peter Singer, Carl Cohen, Immanuel Kant himself, Thomas Regan, Elizabeth Warren, and then Roger Scruton. So there's 6 total authors. And you're going to talk about how you'll talk about the Kantian position on our duties to animals, which we will actually get into today. He doesn't actually think that animals have rights, and that's because they don't have reason or the ability to think about morality. So in his view, they're not members of the moral community, but we have indirect duties to them. So we'll talk about Kant's view. And then you'll talk about how a utilitarian can be either pro or anti-animal. Now, for a pro-animal utilitarian view, you're going to want to speak about Peter Singer for sure. because once he establishes this equal consideration principle, he says at that point the pleasure and pain of animals should be weighed equally in utilitarian decision making about what to do. And that helps him establish his argument for moral vegetarianism, because it means that the pain and suffering of the animals is greatly outweighing any benefits that we derive, which are either trivial or insignificant by comparison to the pain and suffering of the animals and their factory farm conditions and all the rest. One thing I want to make sure to say again about Singer, I guess I didn't mention it in the summary just now, is that his argument doesn't go quite as far as to establish that we're morally required to be vegetarians per se, if there were, let's say, sources of animal flesh and products that didn't involve any suffering, that you'd maybe have to pay more for because they were reared on a smaller local scale and not on the industrial agricultural scale. But he reminds us that even if that's maybe possible, say you're going to boutique markets and spending a lot of extra money to get the more humanely produced meat, dairy, and eggs, it's not generally the way most of the meat, dairy, and eggs are actually produced that most people consume, because there's a lot of kind of capitalistic imperatives about trying to make more efficient the production of it at big scales at the lowest cost to the consumer. So that kind of necessitates this demand for abundant, cheap meat, necessitates cutting corners with respect to animal treatment, and that's what leads to a lot of the practices that cause the pain and suffering. But just dying and just being killed to be used as meat, it's not that really necessarily that's the bothering thing that bothers Singer so much, because it's not argued by him that they have full awareness of what they would be losing if they were painlessly euthanized and treated humanely. So it's the pain and suffering where they have an interest in common with ours. It may not be with the continuation of life, to sort of look back at Michael Tooley's type of argument again. Anyway, then we'll hear from the anti-animal utilitarian perspective just now, which is described by Carl Cohen, our author that we're going to start with. So far, we've really kind of just looked at the pro-animal side. Peter Singer is one author, so we haven't seen too much, but there's been one author so far, together with our introductory comments on this new topic. That was a utilitarian, and that's Singer. Now we're going to hear Carl Cohen give his differing perspective. So this is going to be an argument that animals don't have rights, and that they may morally be it's morally permissible to use them, whether it is for meat, but especially for, he talks about animal experiments for biomedical research. So anyway, the paper prompt requires that you talk about the theories of ethics from Kant and Mill. Then you give how there's these different perspectives or arguments about the status of animals and our treatment of animals. Some people that are utilitarian are basically going to be pro-animal if they think that the pain and suffering of the animals should be weighed in utilitarian decisions, and that outweighs the benefits derived from using them. And that's kind of like how Peter Singer argues. So he's like a pro-animal utilitarian. Carl Cohen, we're going to hear about him just now, but he's ultimately going to say along the way that there's a lot of benefits that come from using animals in experiments, and the total quantity of the benefits that we get far outweighs even the pain and suffering the animals experience. Then there's the Kantian view about our duties to animals. So I think actually in the order of the prompt it says, explain the Kantian view of our duties to animals and explain how a utilitarian can be either an anti or a pro-animal. Kant himself was not like a believer that animals had rights, because he thinks that you have to have rationality, the ability to legislate the moral law. You have to basically be an autonomous moral agent like you and I as persons are before you are a member of the moral community. There's going to be a few other authors too. Thomas Regan, he's got an interesting twist because he's also pro-animal like Singer, but he kind of utilizes a Kantian or deontological framework of ethics to establish his position. So that's interesting because Kant himself, the Kantian, he didn't think animals had rights. But Thomas Regan, he tries to sort of take aspects of Kant's thought and reappropriate them towards a pro-animal position. So it's kind of like neo-Kantian, Regan's appropriation or use of Kantian ideas to establish his own pro-animal argument. And then Marianne Warren and Roger Scruton, they're kind of like Kantian in a sense because, well, Warren's in a little in between. She says that animals have some moral status and they may even have some rights, but even if they do, they're not usually as strong as ours are because they're not as aware of what the right even means or how far it should extend. So she's like saying they have rights, but they're weaker. That's kind of like a meeting in the middle type of view. And then Roger Scruton, the last author that we'll get to at the end, he's going to just say that, yeah, animals don't have rights because they're not rational and they couldn't even understand what rights are. But he also thinks that there's certain animal to human relationships that are important that we should pay attention to. And depending on which kind it is, there's like different sets of duties that apply to each one. So when you give your whole essay, you'll go in that order. You'll talk about the moral theories. You'll talk about the Kantian view of animals. You'll talk about the pro and the anti-animal utilitarian arguments. And you can make reference to all these different authors, but the most crucial for sure are going to be Singer, Cohen, and Kant. And then Regan and the others are sort of more optional for you to use as you see fit, if you want. And finally, at the end, you'll have to state your own view in the debate. Do you think that animals have rights or that they don't have rights? Do you think that the status quo is justified or not? And you'll have to explain your view with reference to the moral theories that we've studied. So if you're like pro-animal, but you do it because, or you feel that way anyway, because you think that they are suffering too much compared to the benefits that we get, then maybe you'd be utilitarian. Or you might be an anti-animal utilitarian that says, you know what, the benefits that we get in total from using animals, they even outweigh the pain and suffering that they experience for that cause. Or you might be more like Kant, who just thinks that they're not rational, so they may be used as a means to an end, and that's not wrong, as it would be if it was a person. Or I don't know, you may be a Regan type or a Singer type who both say on Singer's account, that they've got these rights, or that we should show equal consideration to the like interests that we have with them. Or Regan, more like a neo-Kantian, saying that they should not be treated as a means to an end because it's not about rationality, but just, I don't know, being a subject of a life, pretty much is what he says. In the end, you'll have your view. You're going to either have a view that's more deferential to our status quo or that it's not. But it shouldn't be shallow. It shouldn't just be like, well, meat is delicious, and that's why I don't think it's wrong to eat it. If you don't think it's wrong to eat it, that's totally fine. But I just need you to think about the moral reason that that's justified. Maybe it'll be because you think animals don't have reason, or because they're not members of the moral community because they couldn't understand morality. Or maybe it's just because you'll think that the total pleasure and pain balance weighs in favor of using them for those reasons. But you have to give a moral justification and speak to whether it's more or less Kantian. You could also, of course, be opposed to the status quo and think that animals have rights that are being unrecognized, or that the treatment of them is inappropriate. And if that's your feeling, you'd also give some moral justification at the end of the paper. So just giving you guys a little bit more breakdown and context for the upcoming essay assignment. Just wanted to start today with that. But I don't want to delay any further the actual presentation next of this first essay in today's lesson plan. So let's go right into that. Just give me a second here to put away a couple of these other notes. All right, so Carl Cohen is our author then for today. Carl Cohen, and this is a paper of his from back in 1986. Okay, and it's called "The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Research." Oh, and just last point on this before, we can always come back to it, but about the essay, obviously, if anybody's working on theirs, they want any advice, feedback, commentary, anything at all, or you just want to talk about any of the topics just that we've studied in the class, then please just get in touch with me. You can always email me or come to any of the office hours or whatever you like, and I try to be as helpful as I can. Okay, so then anyway, here we go. Carl Cohen, 1986, The Case for the Use of Animals in Biomedical Research. So he starts off by just saying that two major arguments have been given against the use of animals in biomedical research. This author, by the way, you can see by the title what his ultimate goal is. He's going to try and establish that it's morally permitted to use animals in biomedical research experiments, tests, and then things like that. So here's his first move. He starts by saying his, I guess you could say, intellectual opponent, the person that says we're violating their rights or that we shouldn't do the testing. There's two major arguments that they give against animal experiments. So here we go. I'm going to put this in our typing chat. Two main arguments against animal experiments. Okay, so one, it violates their rights. And two, it imposes too much unnecessary pain and suffering. Maybe I'll put it a different way. It imposes too much avoidable pain and suffering. Okay, now, these are not his views. He's stating the view of the kind of individual who he disagrees with. And these people that oppose the animal experiments, which he supports, what they would say is that the reason it's wrong is, number one, maybe it violates the rights of animals. Or another argument could be that it imposes too much avoidable pain and suffering on the animals. And Carl Cohen, this author, he tries to refute both of those points. So he's now going to sort of take aim at both. This also kind of lays out for us the overall structure of his writing and argumentation in the paper, because he kind of has a dual track type of argument. The first part of it is more Kantian in its approach, because the whole first part of it, he's going to be saying like animals don't have rights. And whenever you make a claim about rights, or who has or who doesn't have them, or what the rights imply, that's Kantian style reasoning, because it's Kantian philosophy which has to do with duties, and rights and duties are correlated with each other. But the second part of his paper, after he makes all this Kantian argument that animals don't have rights, because of some kind of feature that they don't possess, he then becomes more utilitarian at the end, and he says, okay, well, if you just look at the total pain and pleasure that's generated by using animals, it also weighs more heavily in favor of experimenting on. But okay, you see there the 2 points that he's going to now try to rebut. One, it violates rights to use animals in experiments. Two, it imposes too much avoidable pain and suffering on them to do those experiments. So now he gets right into it. Why he thinks animals do not have rights. So the way he rejects the first point there is that he says, well, they don't have rights. And so if you don't have rights, there's nothing to violate. You can't violate rights that don't exist. So why animals have no rights? Here's why, according to him. Okay. He thinks that a right is a claim that one party may make against another. Okay, so this is Cohen's assertion as to what rights are or what they amount to. He thinks of a right. Rights are just claims that one party can make against another. So the important thing to note here is that he thinks rights are claims. They're claims of a certain sort. And when you have a right, you have a claim against others that they honor that right. Now, there's various different types of rights. If I have a right to non-interference, that means that I have a claim on others that they don't interfere with something I have the right to do. So suppose that I have a right to practice a religion of my choice. Then that means that I have a claim against others that if I was disenfranchised from that they would be somehow accountable for a violation of my rights. If I have a right to, say life, I have a right to live, then that means I have a claim against others such that they not kill me, or if they did, that someone would hold them accountable. Of course, not me in that case. So a right is a claim that one party may exercise against another. Suppose that you are a lender, like a lending institution, like a bank, and someone comes and draws out a loan from you. Wouldn't you agree that you have a right to be repaid back because there was a contractual understanding between you and the other party? So since I have a right to claim repayment, that means that if you default on the loan or whatever, I can take measures to claim what's mine because it's my right. If I have a right to my property, okay, and somebody steals it from me, And we do have property rights, or we generally assume that we do. So if we have property rights and you steal something of mine, that means I have a claim that can be pursued legally, in this case, to try and recover those things, or to get compensation from you, or to punish you in some way for the violation of my property rights. So anyway, rights he characterizes as claims. Therefore, we have to know a few things about a given right. To understand a right, he says, we have to know who has that right, against whom it is held, and to what. Okay? So they're claims within a community of moral agents. Only beings, therefore, that are capable of making claims and responding to claims could possibly be members of the moral community, could possibly have rights. So rights are claims that one party can make against another. Okay, so if I take this marker and toss it in the trash, or I don't know, take the cap and remove it, it's not like the marker can make a claim that it's been violated. It's not like it can somehow raise the issue and seek a redress of its grievances, or some type of compensation for the fact that that happened. But if you or I are violated in all kinds of various ways, then we can, and we even do in a lot of cases, through legal systems that we've erected, we make claims and we hold one another accountable. So he thinks that it makes sense to talk about rights only in the context of beings making claims against one another. So that means that in his view, in order to have rights, a being has to have the ability to make moral claims. Now, what is this capacity for making claims? Well, he tries to characterize it in certain ways. On page 589, he says this. He says on page 589, this much is clear about rights in general. They are in every case claims, or potential claims, within a community of moral agents. Rights arise and can be intelligibly defended only among beings who actually do or can make moral claims against one another. Whatever else rights may be, they are necessarily human. Their possessors are persons. The attributes of human beings from which this ability to make claims arises has been described differently by philosophers, both ancient and modern. So St. Augustine called it the inner consciousness of free will, being like aware that you have free will. That was St. Augustine's way of putting this ability to make claims. St. Thomas, the grasp by human reason of the moral law. Okay. Hegel said, the self-conscious participation of human beings in an objective ethical order. Bradley, human membership in an organic moral community. Mead, the development of the human self through the consciousness of other moral selves. So being like aware that there's other moral beings like you that are also capable of making moral judgments, and so on. But most influential has been Immanuel Kant's emphasis on the universal human position of a uniquely moral will and the autonomy its use entails. Humans confront choices that are purely moral. Humans, not dogs or mice, lay down moral laws for others and for themselves. Human beings are self-governing. We are morally autonomous. Animals, he continues, animals lack this capacity for free moral judgment. They are not beings of the kind capable of exercising or responding to moral claims. Animals therefore have no rights, and they can have none. This is the core of the argument about the alleged rights of animals. The holders of rights must have the capacity to comprehend rules of duty, governing all, including themselves. So, right, like a human being, you and I, or a thing like us, a person, can understand, for example, that it has a duty to act a certain way, even if it's inconsistent with its self-interest. So, I may be really poor, and I have a neighbor with a lot more than me, and it's easy to steal from that person without getting caught. But I regulate myself and decline to do it because I realize that he has a right to his things and that that's violating in those rights. but an animal will simply, a non-human animal anyway, will take whatever actions it feels like it wants to take in order to advance its immediate self-interests. So a human can restrict themselves in highly abstract ways from desired actions because of the recognition of a higher moral or even legal order. It takes humans to be able to do that, to be able to withhold on desired outcomes and actions because of the recognition that it's in violation of principles that we believe in. So that's why Cohen thinks that these abilities that would be necessary in order to make claims, they're just absent in other things that are not rational, fully autonomous persons like us. So that's why he thinks they're not eligible to have rights. In order to have rights, you'd have to be able to at least make the claim that the right is related to. A human can raise such a claim, and in fact, humans do raise claims and have them adjudicated and actions taken to restore justice if there ever was a violation. But animals don't have such things as laws, customs, courts, formal or informal modes of moral discipline. So that's why he thinks they don't have rights. So that's why he says, don't worry about violating the rights of animals in biomedical research or perhaps in other areas of using animals, because they don't have rights to violate. They are alive. They can suffer and feel pain, which he understands. But he says just being alive is not enough to establish the right to life. So it's interesting to notice that like much of what he's saying here might recall to mind earlier debates that we studied in the abortion literature, where it was said that the fetus would lack certain, moral standing and didn't have a right to life or whatever because of the fact that it wasn't a person or because it didn't have this ability to have interests and stuff. But now we're talking about Cohen and the animals. So at the same time, he's making this long-winded argument that they don't have rights because why not? Because they're not able to make moral claims. They're just not intellectually or cognitively built that way where they could make moral claims or respond to them. Even after he says that, though, he kind of wants to back off just a little bit. He says, at the same time, I'm not arguing that we could just do anything we want to animals, like torture them for no good reason, and that would be morally acceptable. He kind of wants to somehow finesse this middle ground where they don't have rights, but still there's certain behavior that would still be morally inappropriate. But that's a kind of hard line to walk, because once they don't have rights, it's like using them as a pure means to an end, you would think would make just as much sense as using anything else as a means to an end, but I digress. He says we may have general duties to them, but they're not based on rights. Maybe like duties to do no gratuitous harm, it's just because they're sentient. But notice this. An objection, which was already kind of pointed out by Peter Singer before, is kind of in the air right now. Someone might notice, right, that he's arguing that these animals, they don't have rights. They can be used, killed, abused, harmed, whatever, for the sake of human interests, because they can't make or respond to claims. But if that's the quality that deprives them of rights, then there may be another problem, which is that there are, again, some humans who also are not going to have intellectual capacity to make claims. We're talking about like severely mentally disabled, maybe little infants and toddlers. What about them? Or people with brain damage? Do we want to say that they also don't have any rights? Well, at this point, our author, Carl Cohen, he reverts to a format of argument that Peter Singer kind of highlighted in his essay last time. He uses the reply that they're still members of a rational type of species. So this is his way of making that distinction, that tricky distinction between the low cognitive function humans that he wants to maintain they have the full strength of rights that all the rest of us humans have, but also in the same breath to deny similar animals, at least similar levels of intellectual function, to have any rights because they can't make moral claims. So how can it be the one being that cannot make moral claims has no rights, whereas another being that cannot make moral claims does have the rights? He says the distinctive factor is that in the human mentally disabled or brain damaged case, or infant case, they're still members of the rational kind of species. So members of the rational kind establishes membership in that moral community of that kind, even if not themselves one member. Even if not themselves rational individually, okay? They're members of a rational kind of species, whereas the animals being compared with them are not members of a species that has rationality even in general. Some people, Carl Cohen points out, might oppose his argument by saying that animals have a lot of interesting abilities. They're communicative of a kind, even if it's not fully language based. They can express themselves, and they care for their young, and they exhibit emotions and feelings. And to those points, Carl Cohen is just kind of tough, and he rejects a lot of it. He just says maybe they have some of these capacities to passionately care for their young, to show love, to communicate in a certain way with each other. But he says it doesn't matter because those are still not the capacity for free moral judgment. That's not the capacity for self-aware ability to make moral claims, which he again stands his ground. That's the only real criteria that should establish that something has rights. In his view, a right simply is a claim, and a thing that can't make a claim, it's just incoherent to speak of it having rights. So they have maybe other abilities. He's willing to agree on that. But even if they do, these abilities that they may have, like maternal or paternal behavior, impressive levels of feeling, or non-linguistic communication, they still don't amount to an ability to make moral claims or moral judgments. So he doesn't think that that's relevant, even if he concedes some of it. So in the final area of his paper, he kind of steps up and he says something that might sound a bit controversial. He says, I am a speciesist. He says, in defense of speciesism, which he puts in scare quotes, the word speciesism, because I think he believes that it's just a poor label. He says that, yes, animals can suffer pain. He's going to acknowledge that. But he says it's not true that just being able to suffer pain gives them the same moral status as us. He thinks it is reasonable to show different consideration for the like interest that we share with them in being able to suffer pain, to show greater weight to human interest in avoiding pain than the animal interest in the same thing. Now, Singer would have said that's straight up speciesism. How can you treat the same interest differently in two cases where the interest is the same? Well, he says it's because it's not like racism, speciesism, because with racism, sexism, and these other forms of human bigotry and discrimination, the two sides of the divide are equal in all relevant respects. So if a person that's white discriminates against a person of color just because they're non-white, they're discriminating and treating differently the interests of another being who is the same, is equal. Okay, so it's unequal treatment where the two types of beings are relevantly the same. A man and a woman, if I'm not letting women vote and men vote instead, I'm not showing equal consideration to two types of beings, but they're equal. They're, a woman and a man. There's no moral difference between the two. But he's trying to say that if we don't accord the same weight to animal as compared to human interests, even if it's to the same interest, that's actually justified because when it comes to humans and animals, we're not equal. We're not equal because they can't make moral claims. They don't have that intellectual capacity to make moral judgments or to respond to them. So it's not like racism, because racism is discrimination from a group that has power to one that doesn't. But it's based on a distinction that's not actually got any moral significance. Difference of skin color is an arbitrary distinction. It doesn't mean that there's one that's superior or inferior to the other. So there's no morally relevant distinction between those two classes of beings. But there is a morally relevant distinction, he's saying. That's where the analogy breaks down between humans and animals, because we really are superior to the animals. Men are not superior to women, or vice versa, and with respect to different racial categories, we can say the same. But his argument goes that there is a really morally distinctive difference between us and animals that's not on par with difference of skin color or difference of gender. We're talking about the difference in whether or not the being is even able to make moral claims or respond to them. And that's where he says, analogies fail from the case of racism and sexism to whatever we call speciesism. So again, his reply is that it's not like racism because there's no morally relevant distinction between the two classes of being, but in species there is. It's this difference, and he thinks it's clear. So he kind of just comes right out and says, I am a speciesist, as in it is not wrong to prefer the like interests of my own kind here, since my own kind refers to my species, which is morally distinctive and on a higher level or plane than that of the non-human animals. So he thinks we are therefore justified in preferring our own interests to theirs, even when they compare or are the same. More directly, with respect to our paper prompt 2, this is a helpful point in his essay, and this is one of the core points. He says that animal experimentation in biomedical testing and experiments actually can be justified on just totally utilitarian grounds, even if we include all their pain and suffering and weigh it and compare it against the benefits that we derive from those experiments. Because he has just a way different readout on what the benefits are compared to the pain that animals suffer. So remember back in Peter Singer's essay last time, he really went out of his way to frame the argument about animal experimentation by saying it's stuff like the Dreas test, the LD50 test, these brutal military experiments that are sometimes done for the sake of knowledge that might not even be that important, maybe never will practically apply, or maybe it's just to bring out another product that we already have so many of them in the past. Therefore, the experiments today are no longer necessary, and it's just causing pain and suffering for no great benefit. Okay, so he tried to, lead with examples where it's just a lot of pain and the benefits are questionable. But Cohen has his own different way of looking at it. He says if you're really going to be honest about it, the use of animals in tests and experiments biomedically has been necessary to usher in amazing benefits like all kinds of medicines, prosthetic devices, vaccines that have been tested on animals before humans in human trials. So like he thinks that if you add up all the lives that have been saved and all the diseases and illnesses and pains that have been prevented through the use of animal experiments, it's actually going to weigh very heavily on the side of benefits and happiness, total happiness. So even if the pain and suffering in the animals has its own weight, it's way more farther outweighed by the benefits derived from that, so that if we didn't do these experiments, that would actually be a worse overall balance of total pleasure and pain. So he says you don't even have to exclude animal pain and suffering in this equation. You just have to know two things: that they don't have rights like we do because they can't make moral claims. That's what makes them even eligible as subjects of such tests. But then just considered on their own rights, or I should say, just considered on their own terms, these experiments, he thinks, yield benefits that so greatly deliver, good results and consequences that they outweigh even all the pain and suffering collected by all the animals. So I'll read that word of his right here. He says, so just again, this part of his argument is utilitarian in nature because he's saying like you could take all the pain and suffering of the animals, but it's not trivial benefits that are derived or unnecessary or purely esoteric knowledge that we get from using animals in these tests. He thinks it's very, very robust, profound. It's led to a lot of development for a lot of actual therapies, medicines, technologies, and so on. So he says here, those who claim to base their objection to the use of animals in biomedical research on their reckoning of the net pleasures and pains produced make a second error. Even if it were true that the pains of all animate beings must be counted equally, a cogent utilitarian calculation requires that we weigh all the consequences of the use and the non-use of animals in laboratory research. Critics relying on animal rights may claim to ignore the beneficial results of such research, rights being trump cards to which interest and advantage must give way. But an argument that is explicitly framed in terms of interest and benefit for all over the long run must attend also to the disadvantageous consequences of not using animals in research, and to all the achievements attained and attainable only through their use. The sum of the benefits of their use is totally beyond quantification. So now here we're getting the benefits, he says. The elimination of horrible disease, the increase of longevity, the avoidance of great pain, the saving of lives, and the improvement of the quality of lives for humans and animals, achieved through research using animals, is so incalculably great that the argument of the critics pursued to its conclusion establishes not their view, but its opposite. To refrain from using animals in biomedical research is, on utilitarian grounds, morally wrong. Okay, on utilitarian grounds, just weighing benefits against costs in terms of total pleasure and happiness versus pain, he thinks it's the morally optimistic act. When balancing the pleasures and pains resulting from the use of animals in research, we must not fail to place on the scales the terrible pains that would have resulted, would be suffered now, and would long continue had animals not been used. Every disease eliminated, every vaccine developed, every method of pain relief devised, every surgical procedure invented, every prosthetic device implanted. Indeed, virtually every modern medical therapy is due, in part or whole, to experimentation using animals. Nor may we ignore, in the balancing process, the predictable gains in human and animal well-being that are probably achievable in the future, but that would not be achieved if the decision is made now to stop such research or to cut it back. So, again, I just kind of want to make sure we're keeping clear all the big features of his argument. He starts off in the beginning with a more Kantian line of reasoning where he says that animals don't have rights because they simply can't make claims, which is the quality that is required for something to be a holder of rights. He gives some statements about that and his reasoning. He ultimately then says that they lack rights, so it's morally permitted to use them in ways that it would not be appropriate to use humans. He knows that some people might look at the fact that there are some humans that can't make claims as well, that maybe not cognitively functioning at the right or at least normal level. But he says, no, they're still members of a rational type of species, so that gets them into the same right holder status, even absent that ability of their own, because they're members of that type of species, unlike the animals. He then says that there is a morally relevant difference between us and animals, unlike, say, members of different races or gender categories. So forms of bigotry that are inappropriate with respect to non-equal treatment of interests in the human community those same things that would be discriminatory with respect to humans are justified when it's human to animal, because we really are morally superior to them since we have the ability to make these claims and therefore have rights. Now, at the tail here, he has said that if you really just set aside all the arguments over rights, and now we just kind of turn our attention to a utilitarian framework, he thinks that the total quantity of benefits, even in the utilitarian sense, derived from animal experiments, make that the better choice than to not use such experiments, because in that case we would have to eliminate all the benefits derived from it, and the pain that they suffer, as bad as it is, the total amount of happiness minus pain that exists in the universe is greater if the experiments are being done when we count up the total of both. So a Kantian beginning, a little bit of a utilitarian ending, as he speaks to in his view, massive benefits derived from such experiments in the utilitarian cost-benefit analysis of things. Now, of course, he says we shouldn't use people instead of animals for the same experimental purposes, because that would be using beings that have got rights because they can make these moral claims. So that's something he doesn't think would be a viable alternative. And in many cases, there's no way of running simulations or something to get the same information, because you have to have a live subject for a lot of testing and things that involve a biological specimen. Okay, so that's Cohen. Now, there's one more little companion piece to this, but it's an important piece because it's the words and ideas of Immanuel Kant. Now, for our paper prompt, these were the big three that you kind of had to have at a minimum. You have to have Singer, Cohen, and Kant. So we're going to learn now a little bit about Kant's own view on our duties to animals. Okay. Immanuel Kant. Once again, you may remember that Kant is a man who lived from 1724 to 1804, one of the great philosophers in Western history. And he formulated, a powerful ethical theory that many just refer to as Kantianism. It's the view that says, you should act from a sense of duty to uphold a moral law by following the categorical imperative, which can be expressed in these two different versions. It's not consequentialist. Whether or not it creates the most happiness or doesn't, all you're obligated to do is adhere to the moral law regardless of the consequences. And again, that can be expressed in the categorical imperative. But what are his specific views on our duties to animals? Well, we don't have to speculate on this because Kant himself was quite clear about it in some of his writings. So there's a very short piece in our book of his writing about our duties or lack thereof to animals. And here's his basic position. So he says, we have no direct duties to animals. No direct duties to animals. Now, why? Why not? The reason he gives, why not, is kind of, again, sort of, you're going to see a lot of similar themes in those that deny rights to animals or moral standing because they're lacking in some kind of rational or cognitive capacity. To Kant, we have no direct duties to animals, the reason being because they lack reason and they lack awareness of the moral law. So they don't have reason. They can't think about abstract things. They don't have language. They don't have, symbols. They don't have, vocabulary or grammar. And they also don't have awareness of the moral law. So they're not morally self-governing. They don't write laws. They don't, protect the weak among them from predation by the strong. There's no system of orderly government and so forth. So they can't make moral claims, expressed in many different ways. They're just not rational like we are. Human beings with the advanced intellect that we have highly developed systems of accountability, both formal and informal, and that's just the life of, a human being in an ethical or moral community. So he says, animals, on the other hand, that are non-humans, we do not have direct duties to them. They don't have awareness of the moral law. They're not rational. So remember Kant said that when you are dealing with other human beings, you may never treat them as a means, always as an end. So with a human being, he says, they demand and they should receive ultimate respect. Human beings like you are rational, so you got to respect their rationality by not treating them like just as an object to be manipulated at your benefit for your benefit at their expense. But here we have non-human animals. They don't have moral awareness. They don't have reason. So in his view, you can use them as a means to an end. That's okay. So when we're using animals for food, when we're using them for, clothes, and biomedical experiments, he would say that's using them for a human purpose, whether it's pleasure of the food or clothing that we want to wear or the knowledge that we're going to get from the tests that we run on them or whatever. That's all fine and well because they're not members of the moral community, so they can be used as a means. If it was a human, of course, we can't use humans for any of those purposes according to his ethical system, because that would be using them as a means to other people's purposes, which are at their expense. So let me read his words. One of the nice things about this short section that I assigned to you here is that it's like only one page, and so I can just be a little different, but I'll just basically be able to read it all so that we can talk about each line. It's page 595 of the book, and here Kant is saying this. So Kant starts by referring to another author. This other author's name is Baumgarten, and I don't really know who he is. He's just a person that lived in Germany during the time of Kant's life. But he says, Baumgarten speaks of duties towards beings which are beneath us and beings which are above us. Okay, I'm going to pause at certain points to kind of explain what he's saying. Baumgarten talks of beings beneath us and beings above us. The beings beneath us are the other living things that are not human beings. So we're talking there about, animals. The beings above us, that's kind of a digression, really. It's not relevant to our discussion, but that was all about like spirits and angels. Like if there's supernatural beings that are somehow angelic, those would be the ones above us, like the spirits and ghosts. But anyway, beings beneath us is all we're concerned about. So let's focus on the ones beneath us, the animals. So here's Kant now continuing. He says, so far as animals are concerned, we have no direct duties. Animals are not self-conscious, and they are there merely as a means to an end. That end is man. Okay, what he's saying is animals are not self-conscious. They're just there to be used by us for whatever purposes or goals we see fit. And what is the goal that we're putting them to use for? Ourselves. So, continuing, We can ask, why do animals exist? But to ask, why does man exist, is a ridiculous question. Our duties towards animals are merely indirect duties towards humanity. Okay, now we're getting to something that I have to explain in more detail. So Kant says we have no direct duties to animals for the reason that we mentioned, because they're not rational and they don't understand the moral law. But even though he says that, he also says that we may still be having some, like, what he calls indirect duties to the animals. Okay, let me then explain what that is all about, and I'll put those comments here. So here we have it. Although we have no direct duties to animals, as mentioned before, for those given reasons, this is Kant saying this, okay? Although we have no direct duties to animals, we do have indirect duties to them. And what are those duties? We have indirect duties to not be needlessly cruel to them. Okay, to not be needlessly or unreasonably cruel to them. I'll put it this way: to be kind. No, I'm just gonna say this. Keep it this way: to not be needlessly cruel to them. Better to keep it more minimal. Needlessly cruel. Okay, so although we have no direct duties to animals, we do have indirect duties to what? To not be needlessly cruel to them. And here's why he thinks that's something we have an indirect duty to do. We have that indirect duty to not be needlessly cruel to them because if we are, then it will make us likelier to eventually be cruel to human beings. Okay? Okay, so look at the whole thing that's written up here. This is Kant's thinking, and I'll also read it, straight from the horse's mouth in a minute from him, and you'll hear his words on the same. So he says, although we have no direct duties to animals, because they don't have moral self-governance, they're not rational, regardless of that, we do have indirect duties to not be needlessly cruel to them. Because if we are needlessly cruel, then that means we're going to cause ourselves to eventually mistreat other human beings. Okay? So he thinks this. You have no direct duties to the animals because they just can't make moral judgments. So you don't owe them anything. You have no obligation to treat them any type of way. But he says you should not indulge in cruelty to them, especially cruelty which cannot be given a good reason or justification for, because if you do that kind of stuff, then you're going to develop this habit in your character of just being cruel in general. And then that cruel and brutal behavior that you're cultivating toward animals, it's going to finally rear its head in the way you interact with other human beings. So to protect your gentle sensibilities so that you have the proper conduct towards other humans, you should practice kindness on the animals. Not because you owe it to them directly, but as an indirect duty towards who? Humans. You should try to be kind to the animals. Again, it's like the way that you treat the animal is a reflection of how you're probably going to end up treating people, either at some point in the short term or the long term. So if say that somebody just they're abusive to their pet dog, or any animal. Forget a dog because I know you all love dogs, but suppose someone's a farmer, and they kind of abuse one of the farm animals, whether it's a cow or a pig or something. It could be really any animal at all, but just suppose someone's abusive to an animal. Don't you think that kind of makes them the sort of person who would be willing to use violence or etc. against a person too? Because it just sort of creates a predisposition to be not compassionate toward the sentient being that they're interacting with. So Um, that's the reason that he thinks that we at least should try our best to be kind to them and not cruel. Okay, again, for whose sake? Not for the sake of the animal itself, but for the sake of the human beings who we might poison our kind and gentle treatment of if we create this, habit of behavior over time of being cruel. So it'll basically show itself again to people if we are unnecessarily cruel to the animals. Um, People have sometimes used these indirect duty views to talk about animals almost as though it's like property in a sense. So the analogy is not perfect because property, of course, can't feel anything and it's not sentient. But let me take a pure case of property. If I break the window on your car, right, that's wrong for me to do. It's not acceptable and it's immoral. But why is it wrong? Well, it's not because I violated a duty that I had to the car, because I cannot have a duty to the car because the car can't judge me. The car is not a moral agent. It's just an inanimate object. But indirectly speaking, I have a duty not to break that window, not for the sake of the car, but for the sake of who the owner of the car. It is that person's interests who I will harm. Okay? So it's not a perfect parallel, but kind of like that with the animals and our treatment of them. He's saying you should try your best to be as kind as you can within reason, and not cruel. Because although you don't owe them anything directly because they can't judge you, just like this windshield we talked about a moment ago, it will still establish habits and it will form habits of cruel behavior that are bound to show themselves in time with respect to your dealings with other human beings. And that's when it would become an official bound-in duty, because you have this moral obligation to all the members of the moral community to live by the categorical imperative and not treat them as means and stuff. So to preserve the right treatment of other humans, be kind to the best extent practical toward the animals. Now I'll read a little more, and here's what he said. Before I go on, though, I want to say this too. There have been a few cases, actually. You may have heard some of this if you follow kind of any of these documentaries or true crime or anything. That sometimes there have been like serial killer types, that did horrible things, that killed people, and in the earlier years of their life, sometimes, like in Jeffrey Dahmer's case, we've heard this reported that he got into torturing animals, right? And so he messed around torturing animals as a little kid, and it kind of put him on a path towards when later on in life, he wanted to kill people, or he was desensitized to death and pain. And I'm not saying that necessarily happens to everybody. It's kind of like what Kant is pointing out. He says if you're going to be cruel to the animals for no good reason, it's just not necessary, it's needless, then you're going to instill within yourself certain kind of vicious aspects in your character that are maybe going to reflect themselves in, later on in how you deal with humans. Okay, so I'll read it. He says here, our duties towards animals are merely indirect duties towards humanity. Animal nature has analogies to human nature. So he's saying that sometimes animals remind us of people. He says, by doing our duties to animals in respect of manifestations which correspond to manifestations of human nature, we indirectly do our duty toward humanity. Thus, if a dog has served his master long and faithfully, his service, on the analogy of human service, deserves a reward. And when the dog has grown too old to serve, his master ought to keep him until he dies. Such action helps to support us in our duties towards human beings, where they are official duties. If, then, any acts of animals are analogous to human acts and spring from the same principles, we have duties towards the animals because thus we cultivate the corresponding duties towards human beings. Okay, so when we see things about animals that we think are similar to things we like and respect in people, then we should try to act in some measure similar toward the animal as to humans, because it'll cultivate that type of nice treatment toward our real human counterparts. It says, if a man shoots his dog because the animal is no longer capable of service, he does not fail in his duty to the dog because the dog cannot judge, but his act is inhumane and it damages in himself the humanity which it is his duty to show towards mankind. Okay, so let me point out his example. He says, suppose that someone has a dog and it's been like their companion helping them hunt, but now the dog's gotten so old that it can no longer help, physically on those hunts. Should the man just shoot it because it's outlived its usefulness to him and it was only ever used as a true means to that end, to be helpful toward the facilitation of more effective hunting out in the field? Well, he says, no, if a man shoots him because he can't serve any longer, it's not like he fails the dog, because he can't have duty to the dog since the dog can't know the difference between right and wrong and what obligations are.
but he does say that his act is inhumane and it's damaging in himself the humanity which it is his duty to show towards other humans. So, if you're going to be that cruel to the dog, especially one that's been that loyal and helpful over a long time, let's not say that you killed somebody like you killed a human. Well, you killed something, but let's not say you committed murder like as in the same case with a human where it would be a severe moral breach, because this animal doesn't have the ability to judge anything morally. On the other hand, though, he says still it's going to kind of bring about, how does he put it, damaging yourself to humanity, that it's your duty to show towards mankind. So I'll read a little more. He says, if he is not to stifle his human feelings, he must practice kindness towards animals, because he who is cruel to animals becomes hard also in his dealings with men. That's a key passage. When he's cruel to animals, he becomes hard also in his dealings with men. Okay. So he says we can judge the heart of a man by his treatment of animals. That's a saying I've heard other people say, not just Kant, that looking at how somebody interacts with animals is a good indicator, a good window into how either hostile or gentle they may be towards people. If somebody's, I've always thought that if somebody cares a lot about animals, they're probably going to be pretty nice to people too. But if they're really, really bad to animals, that might also lead them to, not care as much about their fellow man. But he continues. He says, Hogarth depicts this in his engravings. So this is a little obscure, but he's referring to this artist that made these 3-panel engravings during his lifetime. He was a well-known artist, I guess. And in one of them, he has this set of images where it starts off one panel, it's like a little boy pinching a cat's tail or something. Second panel, he's older now, and he runs over someone in his, I guess this would have been a horse-drawn carriage. And then, because it's the old days, right? And then this is the third panel, has him committing murder. So it just sort of shows the evolution of his cruelty over phases in his life. And so he refers to that as an example. He says, Hogarth depicts how cruelty grows and develops. He shows the child's cruelty to animals, pinching the tail of a dog or cat. He then depicts the grown man in his cart running over a child. And lastly, the culmination of cruelty in murder. He thus brings home to us in a terrible fashion the rewards of cruelty. And this should be an impressive lesson to children. The more we come in contact with animals and observe their behavior, the more we love them, because we see how great is their care for their young. It is then difficult for us to be cruel in thought even to a wolf. Leibniz used a tiny worm for purposes of observation, and then carefully replaced it with its leaf on the tree so that it should not come to harm through any act of his. He's talking about somebody who is that sensitive to the well-being of animals, and even if he was messing with a worm to look at it for purposes of observation, he would put it back and make sure he didn't let it come to harm. And he said he would have been sorry, a natural feeling for a humane man, to destroy such a creature for no reason. Now, I find this to be one of the most boldly stated quotes of the whole passage, but it really gets to the heart of what he thinks on these animal issues. He says, tender feelings towards dumb animals develop humane feelings towards mankind. So if you're tender-hearted toward the animals, you're going to also probably be generous and kind and humane toward people. Now, here's a fact that he mentions next, which I didn't really know before ever teaching this class. I mean, I've done it many times now, but the first time I read this, I was a little bit surprised because, during his lifetime back in England, I guess there were certain people that were not allowed to sit on a jury. They would just be eliminated from the jury pool because of their job title. And he's talking about people that did, that were doctors, that worked on surgery and such, and then also butchers who would just be chopping up meat and animal flesh all day. So he says in England, butchers and doctors do not sit on a jury because they are used to the sight of death and become hardened. So they're just so used to blood and gore and all that stuff and death that they don't maybe have the proper sensitivity to the facts of a case when someone's trying to show them or talk to them about how someone got killed. So he says next, vivisectionists who use living animals for their experiments certainly act cruelly. Okay, small point. A vivisectionist is just a word that refers to someone that was doing animal experiments to learn scientific knowledge in a previous era. So he says, vivisectionists who use living animals for their experiments certainly act cruelly, although their aim is praiseworthy, and they can justify their cruelty, since animals must be regarded as man's instruments. Okay, so I want to make a point here. Even though he says we have indirect duties to not be needlessly cruel to them, he says that if we can justify the cruelty by some important human purpose, then that could be morally accepted. I mean, could be easier to justify. In general, he says that we have no direct duties to the animals at all. So even if a person was being cruel to them and using them for needless purposes, which cause them to suffer, he would not technically say that that's a violation of a moral duty, because we only have indirect duties to them. But again, it's a duty directly to humans to not treat them in ways that violate their rights or that use them as a means. And so we'll prepare ourselves for proper treatment of other human beings if we practice kindness on these animals where it's not officially required, but where eventually that same kind of habit of behavior and treatment is going to be necessary in our real relations with other human beings. Now he says, despite us having that indirect duty to not be needlessly cruel, if there is an important enough, significant enough human end, then the animal being used as a means to that, it's a justified form of cruelty. But he does think that cruelty for mere sport is not justifiable. So like sport hunting, just trophy hunting, where you're not actually going to eat the animal or you're not going to like learn anything important about like science from it. He feels that that's a little bit harder to morally justify than, say, using animals for important scientific purposes, like for medical and biomedical experiments, or for maybe food or clothing, something more vital or more necessary. So in his view, it's compatible with having indirect duties of these kinds to have a good reason to use them as a means, and that provides moral justification for it. Since we have no direct duties to them, again, like I started by saying this article, that means that we can treat them as a means, unlike humans that we're never supposed to treat as a means, according to Kant. But even if we're allowed to do that, even when we treat them as a means, it ought to be for some kind of important enough purpose. So that's why he says vivisectionists use living animals for their experiments and they act cruelly, but their aim is praiseworthy. They're not doing this because they just hate animals and they just want to mess with animals. They could justify their cruelty since animals must be regarded as man's instruments, used for our purposes, for our ends. But then he continues and says, but any cruelty for sport cannot be justified. A master who turns out his ass or his dog because the animal can no longer earn its keep manifests a small mind. Our duties towards animals, therefore, are indirect duties towards mankind. So that's really Kant's view. It's kind of, Kant himself is more on the anti-animal side, I would say, in total, but he does go out of his way to try and create this moderate level of recognition for proper treatment of animals that's not overly harsh. So he's really, I think Kant's view as expressed in this essay here is very similar to the one that many people have in everyday life, or the common sense view of the status quo, that you don't like animals to suffer for no good reason. You don't want to see people abuse them when there's not some higher justification behind it. But if you see them suffering for the sake of food that we eat or for the sake of experiments that we do, it can be morally justifiable in those cases because we regard them as our instruments. Since they're not members of the moral community, they lack reason and they lack awareness of the moral law. So a lot of people, I notice, they're not vegetarian, they'll eat meat, but they also don't like animal cruelty. So I think that Kant kind of tries to finesse that middle ground. He's saying they're not on our level and they don't have the moral standing we have. That's why it's even fair to use them as a means in the first place. But while we're at it, using them as a means, we should make sure that it's not just for some trivial or non-essential reason. It should be something that at least has a little bit more substance behind it in terms of need. So that could be in the case of the experiments. He even mentions vivisectionists himself, talks about butchers, and he thinks that maybe those things can be justified because the cruelty is not done for sport. So in summary of everything we've talked about today I guess was kind of like anti-animal day in a lot of ways, because we talked about two authors that share a lot of common ground, Karl Cohen and Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, now we've learned, he's not at all utilitarian. He is de-Kantian, and so he says, if there's a being that's a member of the moral community, you should never treat it as a means. That would be other human beings, for example. But that's because we humans are persons. We have reason, and we have the ability to morally self-legislate and self-govern. But animals, he thinks, don't have those abilities, and that's why we have no direct duties to them. But that's what creates the moral permissibility to use them as food or experiment subjects and so forth. Anyway, though, he thinks that we still may have some indirect duties to them, to not be unnecessarily cruel to them unless there's a high standard of reasoning or justification, because if we were to indulge in that needless cruelty, it would establish habits of behavior and character that would allow us to eventually mistreat human beings too. So, for the sake of our fellow humans, we should practice kindness on the animals so that when we deal with other humans, we're already predisposed to be kind and gentle to them too. Um, he says a man that shoots his dog when it's become too old to serve doesn't fail in his duty to the dog because the dog can't judge anyway because he's not got reason or moral self-awareness. But still, he becomes inhumane and he harms the gentle feelings that it is his duty to show towards mankind. Okay, and then there's Carl Cohen. So Cohen, the first part of his essay, as I was saying before, it's quite Kantian in spirit. And now that we've heard from Kant, I hope that'll even make better sense in context. He's Kantian in the first part because he says they can't make moral claims. It's very similar to Kant's statement that they lack reason and self-awareness. So that's why they can be used as a means. In Kant's view, that's his account. In Cohen's view, it's simply the lacking of ability to make moral claims. He thinks that's what rights even are. And so you couldn't talk about it being that held rights unless it was capable of making those claims, since animals cannot make them nor respond to them. Respond to them meaning it's not like you could say to an animal, this was a violation and you have to now make amends. The animal couldn't possibly understand, any attempt to bring it in line with expectations of its duties. So it can't perform its duties and it can't demand others respond to its claims. So then that's why he thinks they lack rights. That's kind of Kantian in nature because Kant says for similar reasons, this is why they don't have the standing for us to have direct duties to them. But then in the later portion of his essay, Cohen, he kind of switches to a more utilitarian style of argument, and he says, just look at the benefits that come from all the biomedical experiments at least. And if you add those up, it actually creates a utilitarian justification for animal use, since those benefits, in his view, are quite significant, even in terms of comparing it to the costs weighed in terms of all animal suffering. So yeah, this is a contrast for sure from the last lecture where Singer was on the utilitarian side of things, saying that where interests are equal, they should be weighed equally, and we have a common interest in avoiding pain and suffering. And then in his way of trying to explain why we should no longer, eat meat from factory farms or allow animals to be experimented on, it's because they're coming at the cost of significant pain and suffering from animals to either trivial, non-essential, or unnecessary benefits to man. Cohen, he hasn't talked so much about eating them for food, even though he says they've got no rights, so I'm sure he would find no moral fault in that action. He highlights more the biomedical experiments where it's easier to point towards significant utilitarian benefits derived from it as compared to just the trivial and passing pleasures of taste when you eat meat. Okay, guys, so this was it for now. This was a lecture of two authors smashed into one meeting, so it was a little bit less time, screen time for you. Hopefully that's not a problem for anybody, but I'll be back in touch with you soon as I contact you over the weekend with more lectures to come for next week. There's just a few more in the animal topic and a few more in the class overall before we start to prepare for our final. But I want to thank you guys again, and if you need me for any reason, as always, just contact me. But yeah, have a good one for now, and I'll talk to you soon.